particular time, I've decided, because of the recent conference in London, to review the manifesto and the speech given by General Sejusa. So, in a way, it is also this review is about democratization, as you will find out as I go along. But I thought it was very, very important that I make a review of this manifesto because it is an important document, and the speech that accompanied it, which was given by General David Sejusa. The first question to ask in this review is whether the challenge identified by Freedom and Unity Front manifesto, which I will refer to as the FAF, Freedom and Unity Front, FAF, which Ugandans are facing today, is the one we are really facing. The challenge, according to FAF manifesto, is, quote, to fashion a new socio-political system, unquote. I hear echoes of the movement system in the late 1980s and the early 1990s in FAF's manifesto formulation of the challenge Uganda is facing today. We were told in 1986 that a unique movement system would cure all the political ailments Ugandans suffered from in the 1970s and 1980s, caused by the dictators that during that period, simply because it was a broad-based government and that had no political opposition. The absence of political opposition was projected as a positive factor in a democracy, which was, of course, a mistake. Today, we are facing the drawing board again. Which way do we go this time? My main objective in this review of FAF Manifesto and General David Sejusa's speech in London is to point out the flaws in the manifesto and the speech in the hope that we can learn some lessons from our past mistakes. For that reason, I want to thank the authors of the manifesto for their contribution to our cause in search of liberty, security, and justice in Uganda. For General Sejusa, I'm not yet sure what his primary motivation is. Is it the courage of a trained, fearless soldier? Is it the ambition of a calculating politician whose options are running out? Or is it the shrewdness of a seasoned spy that is propelling him in his political venture? Hopefully, at the end of my review, you will have some of the answers to these three questions. First, I address FAF's diagnosis and the prescriptions of what we need to do in Uganda. The problem Uganda faces today does not lie in the absence of democratic institutions, in my opinion, but with the people who mismanage or abuse the political institutions for various reasons such as corruption, tribalism or sectarianism, and occasionally incompetence, usually caused by corruption. But if the problem is naivety, part of the problem here is naivety of Ugandans. Who are some of the players who are manipulated as puppets by those at the top who exploit them. If this is true, then we are not. We do not need to reinvent the wheel every time we overthrow a brutal dictator in order to recover from dictatorship. We only need to ensure that the checks and balances that guarantee the operation of a healthy democratic system are in place. These mechanisms were invented a long time ago through democratization. They are embedded in the principles of separation of powers and rule of law. We therefore do not have to reinvent them by fashioning what FAF calls a new socio-political system. What is curious about FAF's manifesto is its almost deafening silence about federalism. This is curious because anyone seeking to establish a democratic system must at the same time be interested in federalism or something analogous to federalism, such as that found in Kenya and South Africa. Federalism is the ultimate structural component of a democratic checks and balances, which FAF relegates to the periphery at the end of the manifesto. By declaring that FAF supports, quote, equitable devolution of powers with effective checks and balances of power, unquote, it is clear that FAF does not enthusiastically endorse federalism. A majority of the Ugandan groups I'm aware of now opposing NRM regime have endorsed federalism, which NRM adherents pathologically detest and have fought tooth and nail to defeat in the past. Moreover, federalism should be a part of the so-called effective checks and balances of power, which is supported by FAF. Nevertheless, FAF promises that, quote, at the very least, the leadership of FAF intends to revisit and explore the reintroduction of the key tenets of the 1962 Independence Constitution as a possible model of constitutional order. Those of you trained as lawyers, when you read this carefully, you know that they are not endorsing federalism. They are trying to send a message. This last statement seems to be targeted at Buganda audience. FAF should come out explicitly if it is to be trusted by the audience. It targets to hoodwink. The old Oboteist tricks may not work this time around. The prescribed treatment of the disease diagnosed by FAF does not seem to be compatible with an effective treatment of the patient severely suffering from the disease diagnosed. if the disease was caused by the absence of democracy, that is, the absence of checks and balances, then it follows that the solution must be democratization of Uganda by creating the necessary checks and balances rather than fashioning, quote, a new socio-political system, unquote. The real problem in Uganda is the absence of democracy, as I've pointed out, not the absence of a new socio-political system. It is also not lack of unity in the country, as some may assume. In fact, the Prof uses the word unity in its title, the Freedom and Unity Front, which implies that Prof is designed to bring about unity among Ugandans. The real problem in Uganda is the absence of democracy, not the absence of a specific political system. It is also not lack of unity in the country, as some of people may assume. There is no serious problem of disintegration of the nation of Uganda, similar to what happened in Sudan or Ethiopia, for example, where parts of those countries seceded and became independent nations. We don't have that threat today in Uganda, to the best of my knowledge. Judging by comparative politics in East Africa at this time, Ugandans are not any less united than the Kenyans or Tanzanians are. What we are seriously lacking in Uganda is democracy, and especially regular, free and fair elections leading to a peaceful change of government. The idea of promoting unity through the old and dangerous idea of broad-based government must be abandoned and forgotten. It was the idea of broad-based government that formed the basis and causation of corruption, because broad-based government under NRA justified the suppression of political freedom under the bogus theory of sectarianism, which argued that democracy cannot exist in Africa where there is no middle class. Put another way, according to the bogus theory, which I have sufficiently discussed in my previous conversations, a democratic system of checks and balances which stimulates and maintains the adversarial checks and balances of democratic government could not work in Africa for the simple reason that there is no middle class. That was the argument for the movement system. Of course, the theory was bogus, as I pointed out. The same people who advocated the bogus theory decided in 2005, before even a middle class was formed in Uganda, that when circumstances suited them, that it was time to restore multi-party system. The rest is history, and that was playing politics of the worst kind. Now let me talk about political morality, because it forms a central theme in Prof manifesto. The manifesto is drafted using vague concepts such as unbalanced and unhealthy power relations, inherited imbalances which engendered structural bottlenecks in the neo-colonial period, and lack of political morality in governance, unquote. These terms and phrases are not defined in the manifesto. They tend to create an ideological haze or a political mist that obscure a clear view of what the authors of the FAF manifesto want to convey. The manifesto, for example, points out that Museveni has reneged on the promises made during the past 2 decades. If this is so, then where do the leaders of FAF, like Sejusa, get the moral authority to condemn Museveni's behavior when they have been a part of Museveni's dictatorship during the last period all along? The most moral argument is diluted by the historical facts as they exist today because they are inconsistent with the FAF's manifesto argument. The state terrorism manifested in the Black Mamba descending on the High Court to take prisoners released by the High Court and the assassinations of political opponents such as Andrew Lutakome Kaira, March 6, 1987, Brigadier Noble Mayombo, April 30th, 2007, Major General James Kazini, November 10, 2009, and Seria Nebanda, MP, December 12, 2012. These names are also cited in the manifesto as acts of state terrorism in which intelligence officers must have played a crucial role in the realization of these acts of state terrorism. These acts of state terrorism, which are incompatible with the political morality preached by FAF, stretch across the entire tenure of Museveni's brutal dictatorship, beginning with Kaira's assassination in 1987 and ending with Nebanda's poisoning in 2012. They are therefore not exceptional or anomalous acts which are not unique to NRM regime. They display a pattern of routine similar to that we witnessed under apartheid. Some acts of terrorism were actually committed by the same people during the war in the Royal Triangle before NRM took over power in 1986, when Guedeko was executed in 1983. This means that Sejusa, a knowledgeable insider within NRM, has a lot of explanations to do. He was a part of the planning, execution, and the cover-up of these acts of state terrorism, whose primary purpose was first to eliminate political opponents and then, hopefully, to cause sufficient pathological fear in the population in order to prevent the people from uprising and demanding their inherent human rights protected by the Constitution. Can Sejusa now claim to be a political angel sent from heaven to rid Ugandans of the political devil he has served and hobnobbed with for 27 years? Where can we find the so-called political morality FAF manifesto is talking about We cannot invent it and then inject it into Uganda's recent history. Suppression of political freedom by Museveni using NRM is a manifestation of the absence of political morality. It did not start with the enactment of POMA, public, the law enacted recently this year, the Public Order Management Act, or POMA. From the beginning, in 1986, NRM regime suppressed political freedom. In 1995, Article 269 constitutionalized the suppression of political freedom, which had been going on as NRM policy since 1986, when NRM was first established. Here, the blame game should go beyond dictator Museveni. The very essence of suppression of political freedom was built into the political structure and ideology on which NRM was founded. Suppression of political freedom was an inherent part of NRM political fabric. The Constituent Assembly, collectively and its individual members, that passed the 1995 Constitution, must share some of the blame. They enacted a constitution which legitimized this oppressive movement system that violated political morality. The leader of NRM intelligence agencies, who authorized the kidnapping leaders of opposition who were charged with violating the repressive laws of Uganda, must also share the blame. All top leaders of NRM, and especially members of the cabinet, must equally share in the blame, regardless of whether they occupied their cabinet position by virtue of their political ingenuity or unswerving naivety. There is no excuse for it. A cunning Museveni just opportunistically, as usual, exploited the situation to his advantage. There were many collaborators involved in the process, which FAF manifesto refers to as the, quote, shrinkage of political space, unquote. Indeed, for this reason, there is a moral ground to prohibit those who actively collaborated in the process of suppressing liberty or inherent human rights not to be allowed to participate in the next government after the fall of NRM regime. Political logic demands it, prudence endorses it, and political morality cries out for it. The authors of FAF Manifesto must be reminded that the suppression of the media by NRM is not a new dictatorship tactic. As a military leader, Museveni knows very well the difference between using tactics for short-term objectives and employing strategies in achieving long-term political goals. Museveni has used both very well in the past, but he is soon running out of fuel to exploit or sustain any of these tricks. The amendment of the sedition law in 1987 to criminalize sectarianism, for example, was part of Museveni's two techniques to weaken his opponents using the law. He never believed in enforcing the sectarian law. It was a legal weapon to cripple his political enemies. Museveni, FAF manifesto agrees with me, has been one of the most sectarian leaders Uganda has ever seen. In a letter to the Minister of the Presidency, Wabudeya, Museveni explicitly endorsed sectarianism as an acceptable method to enforce ring fencing certain electoral positions in dealing with the Bafuric controversy in Bunyoro in 2007-2008. Throughout Museveni's long tenure, NRM has never tolerated free media or respected its hard-working reporters as essential freedom fighters. This is not something that has just started to happen recently. Tebaire has documented Museveni's anti-media policies during the last 33 decades. Those who have served the NRM regime for a long time, like Sejusa, who ordered the arrest of journalists like Kalundi Serumaga in 2009, are equally to blame for the problems afflicting Ugandans and the violation of what FAF manifesto calls political morality. As recent as 2013, the offices of the Monitor publications were closed down by NRM regime for 10 days, supposedly searching for Sejusa's letter about the alleged Moho's project. The government did not clear in a clear violation of the court order, just as the Kampala City Authority defied a High Court ruling. This was a malicious political tactic springing from the depths of Museveni's dark heart. There was no legal justification to shut down the Monitor publications for 10 days, supposedly to search for Sejusa's letter. The real purpose was to punish financially the Monitor publications as a means of forcing the company to suffer financial losses and, as a result, to practice self-censorship and thereby become a less potent media weapon in exposing Museveni's dictatorship and NRM political atrocities. I'm sure Sejusa knows this very well. Museveni was applying one of his lethal tactics from his dictator's armory. You cannot have democracy with a leader or personality like that. That is exactly why political freedom and individual liberty cannot be guaranteed under Museveni's leadership. NRM under Museveni has never been known to observe the rule of law. All acts of state terrorism and corruption are flagrant violations of the rule of law. In the third case of Sejusa, it is the hunter who has become the hunted. If we are to believe what the FAF leadership is saying today, they must show us the evidence proving that they did not participate in the violation of human rights at the time, or that they, at that particular time, refused to execute Museveni's orders violating human rights. The Rome Statute, which is part of the law of Uganda today, is clear on this point. Executing illegal orders issued by superiors is not a valid excuse or defense for violating the law. Otherwise, FARC leaders who participated in Museveni's atrocities have no excuse for violating the rule of law, and especially the law of war. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 have been part of the law of Uganda since 1974. Therefore, the Geneva Conventions were part of the law of Uganda since the Nakrabi massacre of 1964, the crisis of 1966, the war in the Rural Triangle, and the so-called Northern Pacification. The brutality of police officers under NRM has been exposed in many incidents involving the illegal arrest and torture of Turinawe, Besigye, and Lukwago. Uganda ratified the Convention Against Torture in 1987. Recently, a law domesticating the Convention Against Torture and criminalizing torture was enacted by Parliament. Kaihura does not seem to pay attention to these laws, under which victims of torture have a right to sue him personally or other police officers who commit torture to be compensated for the suffering resulting from the torture inflicted by the police on innocent people. Museveni, who is the dark force behind these criminal acts, is hiding in the background, praying that he will get away with his habitual criminal conduct. I have bad news for him and all those involved in these nefarious acts. The law is bound to catch up with you sooner than later. The Truth Commission is coming. Moral authority comes from actual actions of bravery and not self-serving personal declarations or political manifestos. Mandela's courage and leadership universally taught us what political morality means. It involves personal risk, but it all is always based on the truth and the commitment to justice and liberty, not personal ambition. It is important to remember that NRM and Museveni's policies did not exist in a political vacuum. Sejusta must be very familiar with the arrests and the closures of media outlets in 2009 during the Kampala-Kayunga riots. In fairness, we cannot just blame Museveni today because it suits the political circumstances of those who now happen to disassociate themselves from the NRM regime. If we are objective enough, we must go beyond Museveni's dictatorship. It is not sufficient just to condemn for opportunistic reasons or blame Museveni for anything that has gone wrong. There are many others who contributed directly or indirectly. Who are those people? NRM is a political organization in which many of the deserters have belonged to they have belonged to NRM for a long time. These deserters must tell us explicitly why they are deserting NRM and what, in their view, is now going on with NRM. What is wrong with NRM if we are to believe what they are saying, they are telling us, and condemn Museveni fairly. Political morality, as Prof Manifesto points out, has a role to play in this liberation process. Political morality, of course, has to be, we have to be fair. It is not sufficient to say Museveni is a terrible dictator. I'm here to fight him with you. Why are you fighting him now, after working for him for so long? What is your political philosophy? When did you acquire that political philosophy? I'll take a short break here, and I'll come back and continue the conversation. Thank you very much. After a short break, I'm back to continue the conversation. We cannot forget the NRM military policy predates Museveni's rise to power as president of Uganda in 1986. Therefore, NRM military policy is not entirely a one-man product. The command structure of NRA army and the elimination of certain commanders in the field, like Guedeko, during the Bush War, were not the result of Museveni's ideas by himself alone. Moreover, Museveni's dictatorship did not rise overnight. It gradually took root through deception, political cajoling, corruption, elimination of opponents, and sheer maneuvering within the political system. We know this because we know the history. Many people participated in the formulation and implementation of NRM policies that brought about the realization of the oppressive NRM political goals. We are told by those who fought in the war or who commanded the NRA fighters that leadership in NRA was originally democratic, and the decisions were made collectively up to a certain level. When NRA later became UPDF, policies which are today found to be defective, all those who contributed to their formulation must equally share the blame. And I'm pointing out this because Prof seems to forget certain historical facts. Museveni was the leader, but not necessarily the initiator of all ideas. But we are fully aware that when you become a dictator, you have to assume responsibility for all the consequences of dictatorship. We are fully aware of that, but that does not excuse those who participated in this process. For example, the policy of politicizing the army, which FAF manifesto calls abuse of the military, originated from the false assumption that the army was a political institution which deserved representation in parliament because of its role in liberating the country. China, which is not a model of democracy, inspired Museveni to adopt a similar policy for ideological reasons. This short-sighted and anti-democratic policy, which nevertheless made sense for many people in Uganda at the time, both soldiers and civilians, we must admit, was first implemented by A. Milton Obote in the early 1980s when he was fighting the insurgency, whose army had in fact liberated no one. Obote's army was represented in parliament, but although it had liberated no one. The primary objective for representation of the army in parliament was to use the army representatives to control decisions in parliament. This made justification of the army representation in parliament a philosophically empty argument. Museveni, a shrewd, cunning student of Obote, saw an opportunity dangling before his eyes and grabbed it, the opportunity immediately. NRM, an organization he led and continues to lead, adopted the policy after the Bush War by associating the army with military heroism that deserved reward and recognition. All the arguments justifying army representation were in fact no more than political blackmail. The arguments, whether citing the Chinese experience army as a political liberator, did not, however, convert a bad anti-democratic policy into a good policy simply because NRM unanimously endorsed and adopted it. State institutions, that is civil service, police, and the army, should not be politicized. Politicization of state institutions contravenes the basic tenets of democracy. The logic rendering the state institutions politically neutral is simple, it is wise, and vindicated by historic experience. In a democratic political system, parties change often, but the state institutions remain the same and permanent. They may serve different regimes without being indoctrinated with a specific ideology or political philosophy of one or political party. The communist regimes did this for ideological reasons which are not applicable in a democratic system. Museveni and his colleagues could never get this point correct. They were only interested in monopolizing political power, not in democratizing it. Moreover, politicization of the Uganda army was not a one-man decision. Therefore, we cannot blame Museveni alone for abusing the military as FAF manifesto does. Museveni abusing the military was an inevitable consequence of politicizing the army by, among other privileges, granting the army a constitutional right for representation in parliament. Any other leader other than Museveni, under the same circumstances, would have done the same. The Constitutional Commission, headed by Benjamin Odochi, and the Constituency Assembly under Wakapabulo, which debated the Constitutional Commission's report and recommendations in the report, are equally to blame because they both laid the ground on which the policy to politicize the army by allowing it to be represented in the parliament was endorsed. It is therefore nothing more than sour grapes for Sejusa to point out the obvious in his speech at the FAF meeting in London, that when it came to remove term limits from the Constitution in 2005, the representatives of the army, 10 of them, were literally ordered to vote affirmatively to remove the term limits. In a democracy, no representative of the people should be under any obligation to vote one way or another. That contravenes the concept of representative government. What else did the people who endorsed the policy or anybody else expect a politicized army to behave or would be treated by their political masters? We cannot, under the circumstances, honestly and objectively just blame Obote alone, Museveni alone. All the participants who contributed to that tragic decision should be blamed with a view of rectifying the mistake in the future by genuinely creating genuinely democratic institutions. This bad precedent should serve as a warning to be careful in the process of democratization in the future. Now, let me talk briefly about personality and politics which manifesto tries to go around the issue. It is amusing, if not amazing, that people are surprised by Museveni's U-turn on the ICC issue. The answer lies in personality. A large portion of political behavior is driven by the nature and the content of personality. That is true from Nelson Mandela to Idi Amin, Obote, and Museveni. The behavior of people, including leaders, is partly caused by their personality. You cannot predict Mubilu Musoke. You can predict Mubilu Musoke's behavior under certain circumstances if you have sufficient data about his personality. In the case of Museveni, because of his personality, he neither believes nor in a rational political philosophy, nor consistent reliance on political principles to guide his behavior in making his political decisions. Dictators cannot have a commitment to principles because principles restrain arbitrary political actions, something dictators have no discipline, ability, or patience for. Dictators prefer or are habituated to deception and use of force to achieve their selfish ends. Here, let me point out one historic example. Do you remember the Nairobi Agreement signed between Museveni and Lutua in December 1985? It was a waste of time. The results were predictable for those who could read the mind of a dictator like Museveni. So I am therefore surprised that Sejusa has complained about Museveni's political inconsistencies. Museveni's behavior is the result of his defective personality, which fuels his dictatorship. His personality has not just recently evolved, but has been part of his character throughout his life since he was a youth. To that extent, Museveni's political behavior is predictable under certain circumstances. Museveni has always believed in having his way, regardless. Museveni, like all dictators, has first thirst for domination. He loves to be viewed as the greatest person who ever lived, and as a result, Museveni would do anything, including killing, in order to achieve his goal. He craves for power. One bizarre illustration of this is Article 6 of the NRM Constitution. It provides that NRM is a multi-ideological political organization. What on earth can that mean? Who wrote that article, and for what purpose? Irrational as it is, Article 6 of NRM Constitution was strategically designed to allow anybody to become a member of NRM, irrespective of political philosophy or ideology. There is no question that Article 6 of NRM Constitution bears all the absurdities of Museveni's unlimited greed for power. But how would all the other members of NRM accept such a stupid proposal? one wonders. The explanation is that rationality does not count under dictatorship. Pathological personalities, rather than reason, dominate politics under dictatorship. Then what explains the longevity of dictators? Brute force, that is temporarily, which temporarily tames the animal kingdom through pathological fear, is the answer. But as soon as the people understand the nature of the dictatorship and purge themselves of the pathological fear of the dictator, dictatorship becomes an endangered species. That is the basic function of the democratic process. It nips potential dictators in the bud. Nature, even in politics, eventually takes its course to minimize, if not wipe out, dictatorship in the long run. That is why Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Muammar Gaddafi are relics of history. They are denied the greatness they strove so hard to achieve through bloody battles. Greatness is inevitably bestowed on the genuine heroes like Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Abraham Lincoln. Museveni's personality is abundantly illustrated by his own autobiography, The Sowing of the Mustard Seed, which we have thoroughly reviewed in our earlier conversations. Therefore, the elements of duplicity and manipulation in Museveni's political behavior, as the Prof manifesto points out, are inherent parts of Museveni's personality. There is nothing surprising here. In particular, those who joined Museveni and worked with him, observed his behavior in the bush, endorsed his policies in NRM regime, should have very little to complain about, let alone being surprised by Museveni's behavior after 30 years of observing his political behavior. The description of Museveni's behavior by Prof manifesto is valid. If it is valid, then one has to look when his personality, that's Museveni's personality, was transformed in order to make him behave as he does today. If Museveni's behavior originated from his personality, which we have to assume that Museveni has always behaved the same way, that is, he has always been intolerant and of dissent. He has been infected with fear of democratic competition and accountability. I'm here quoting the Prof manifesto, and, quote, lives in perpetual fear because he thinks people will want him to account for the harm and destruction he has done, unquote. If these assumptions in the Prof manifesto are valid, and we believe they are, then they help us to explain why Museveni is an incorrigible, corrupt leader. His personality inevitably leads him into corruption in order to sustain his hold on to power. As a micromanager, Museveni's corrupt fingerprint is found in many of the corrupt deals he injects into himself into. This conclusion is consistent with the Human Rights Watch finding in their research on corruption in a report published in October 2013. The existence of NRM regime today is sustained by corruption. Personality and political behavior have totally merged, making the case of regime change inevitable. We are glad to have Prof join us in this struggle, subject to all the provisos stipulated in this review. Now let us look at corruption under Museveni's behavior, which Prof points out several times in the manifesto. Corruption in Uganda manifests itself in many areas and forms. Corruption is to be found in all sectors of the economy and society at large. It is firmly embedded at the core of NRM political system in such areas as the Electoral Commission, which is an extension of the President's office. Corruption has found a secure hibernation place in Parliament, an institution which is supposed to be a corruption watchdog. Corruption has thoroughly infested the Land Titles Office, where shame and wrongdoing are looked down upon. Corruption has secured a permanent niche in the offices of the permanent secretaries and the Bank of Uganda, which are supposed to be the accounting places for the receipt and expenditure of all government resources. Corruption is the main driving force in creating employee ghosts in UPDF, the Uganda People's Defense Force, the police, and many schools and universities. Corruption thrives where it should not, such as public procurement processes, municipalities, and district offices. But above all, corruption has also penetrated the so-called temples of justice, where decisions of life and death are made in the magistrates' court, in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, and the Judicial Service Commission that replenishes their membership. So, tell me where in Uganda corruption is a strange visitor who is unwelcome at the dining table. Therefore, in light of these facts, the problem of environmental degradation is not an independent problem, as FAF manifesto seems to assume. It is part of the problem of corruption, which has been one of the most serious problems which has afflicted the NRM regime. The problem has too many sources. Corruption was planted as a mustard seed in the original NRM regime structure of broad-based government that suppressed political freedom and eliminated the checks and balances on the executive branch and the legislature. Without democracy, you cannot control corruption. Uganda under NRM is a classic example, sad as it is. Secondly, Museveni's personality found fertile ground in the NRM system to benefit from corruption, whether the project is foreign investment oil exploration, protection of environment, abuse and misuse of armed forces, appointment of judges, or manipulating parliament to achieve a specific political agenda. For example, inviting NRM caucus or Kampala city councillors to State House to be bribed and given specific instructions to make the wrong decisions for the people, such as enacting the repressive laws such as POMA, the Public Order Management Act. All these activities fall under the subject of corruption. I think the FAF manifesto has missed this point by just identifying a few areas. The only mystery is why Museveni and his close allies are so susceptible to corruption. In order to answer this question or explain the puzzle behind it, we can only rely on speculative thought guided by research and available public information. The answer is that Museveni comes from a minority community which in the past viciously dominated a majority ethnic group for centuries. In order to do so, the minority group had to depend on either brute force, which was common, or corruption and deception, which often paid handsome dividends to the minority oppressors. These elements were gradually, over centuries, translated into the culture and hence the personalities of the minority group. It is now part of the cultural behavior of the whole group. This sounds should explain the so-called division of the Tutsi Empire in the Great Lakes region. What you cannot achieve through force, deception, and theft, you may secure through corruption. Take, for example, the disproportionate greed of these groups in land grabbing. They are the world, the world through, the different ethnic lenses. They see the world through very, very different ethnic lenses. In fact, democratization is a big threat to these ethnic groups, which are used to get their way regardless. In Uganda, land grabbing is not a separate subject from corruption, as FAF manifesto seems to believe. In fact, the problem of corruption is best understood by looking closely at the corruption that has made land titles in Uganda, and especially in Buganda and Kampala area in particular, a very serious competitive corruption problem. The turmoil in Kampala City Authority may not appear to be related to corruption in land transactions, but in fact it is. The amount of corruption in Kampala City Council is astounding. Even the IGG has investigated many of these cases, which I have read. The beneficiaries of the corrupt so-called mafia group is not ready to abandon their looted gains or forfeit future corrupt deals. That is why the president is involved in, he has involved himself being the godfather of the corrupt tycoons that do business in Kampala City, especially the markets milked by Basajabalava, which have been going on, these markets have been going up in flames since 2009 without a single police investigation report to the, published to explain who caused these fires or who causes these fires, who is responsible for the persistent arson. That is corruption. Corruption has mutated from being just corruption into organized crime in Uganda. And that is serious. As a final solution to the problem of corruption, FAF will, quote, establish independent international tribunal to work on investigation and restitution of stolen assets back to the people of Uganda, unquote. This is a good proposal which should eventually be implemented. Democratization cannot be achieved in Uganda without the recovery of stolen assets belonging to the state or the people collectively. Destruction of impunity is an indispensable part of democratization. I endorse this proposal by FAF manifesto. We have similar but very far more radical proposals ourselves than FAF manifesto proposes. Now, what about FAF political philosophy? Does it have one, or should we just trust it that it is okay without its political philosophy? The closest FAF manifesto comes to articulate a political philosophy is by pointing out what the authors of the manifesto believe are the two functions of government, namely, first, to provide conditions for the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms and rights by the citizens, and two, to foster the welfare and human security of citizens. If the government fails to do these two things, the manifesto says, it forfeits its claims to the allegiance of the citizens. Fair enough. Let us also remember that in the first edition of a publication called The Resistance News, published by NRM during the Luwero Triangle War, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni wrote an article in which he declared that the people have a right to rebel against an oppressive regime. Museveni, are you listening? I'm reminding you what you wrote. Museveni, after he grabbed the state power, became the most repressive leader Uganda has ever known. Museveni's regime charged more people, more opposition leaders for treason than Obote, Amin, and Rutwa combined. Declaring certain things during a liberation struggle to attract support is one thing. Practicing what you teach when one is in power is quite another. This is why it is important to know the political philosophy of all those engaged in the liberation struggle. But first, it is interesting to note that FAF manifesto does not mention NRM regime at all throughout the document. Instead, it substitutes NRM regime for the regime of President Museveni, as if there is a substantive difference between a personalized description of their subject matter and the NRM regime. Why are they trying to avoid the label NRM? Is it because they feel guilty due to their long association with the NRM regime? The alleged incorrigible abuse of power, sordid corruption, crippling poverty for the great majority of people, the professionalization of the military, and the destabilization of the threats to international peace and security in the Great Lakes region of Africa have been going on for at least 2 decades. Abuse of power and sordid corruption go back to the beginning of NRM regime. They are reflected in the earliest commissions of inquiry into the police corruption and the junk helicopters inquiry, judicial commission inquiry. The so-called deep professionalization of the military started in the Bush War, when a decision was made to politicize and indoctrinate the Bush War combatants, who were at that time subjected to NRM political education in the form of captive audiences. When Uganda and Rwanda invaded Congo, it posed, quote, a threat to international peace and security, unquote. Therefore, many of the actions FAF manifesto participated and approved at the time, they were made. They approved these activities. Therefore, the best seducer can do to protect his reputation is to support regime change in Uganda without himself being a part of the leadership of FAF or the government that follows. He has no moral authority to repudiate NRM policies he participated in formulating and enforcing, which now, according to the manifesto, he is explicitly repudiating. And that's why we ask, under what circumstances, what political philosophies is he relying on? Now, let me take a very, very short break here before I conclude this conversation with a review of a General Seducer's speech itself. It's coming next. Thank you very much.
Tugambire Muhammad naye ajje kuno
After a short break, I'm back to continue this conversation with a brief review of General Sejusa's speech in London. That speech was the occasion on which the manifesto was inaugurated. General David Sejusa's speech ranges far and wide. It contains a confession of participation in electoral crimes, for which, as far as I am aware, he has not yet obtained immunity against prosecution, unless, of course, he assumes that waging war against his former NRM colleague, Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, is by itself a guarantee of immunity, in which case he still believes in some form of corruption or the cutting of corners through which one expects to be rewarded and protected from criminal deeds simply because one is contributing to a common cause in which corruption, in which many people have invested a valuable dividend. You lose credibility when you condemn corruption, as Sejusa has done and the memorandum, the manifesto has done, but use corruption, corrupt means, to wage a liberation war. That is why terrorism ultimately fails, because it has no moral sustenance. One of the problems we are faced with today is to uproot dictatorship in order to democratize Uganda. Sejusa capitalizes on this problem by invoking the superpower whose interests in the democratization process, he argues, gives the superpower no choice but to favor the democratizers, that is, the liberation fighters. Between this wide and elastic range, apparently the result of the absence of a rational theme in the speech, the listeners were entertained by the speaker's desires to look good before them, because he himself said that he was a new man. Those are his words, new man. This is the source of his apparent conviction that as long as the superpowers want to protect their interests, they have to choose, but they have no choice but to aid the democratization process, and probably, preferably, they will wisely choose between David and Yoweri. The choices are, I believe, at this point, far wider than David and Yoweri may believe. In his speech, General Sejusa asked, "We as people, do we have a right to be free or not?" Should we be prisoners, or should we be free? Should we free ourselves? Unquote. The mere fact that General Sejusa could ask such rhetorical questions is revealing. A person with a concrete philosophical conviction that he is entitled to liberty, security, and justice cannot pose rhetorical questions like that. I can't imagine Mandela posing questions like that. I can't imagine Martin Luther King posing questions like that. These questions tend to imply that he's wavering in his political philosophy. Would slaves fighting for emancipation pose such rhetorical questions? How would Sejusa have answered those same questions he posed to himself if he was Namboze in 2009 during the riots, Kayunga Kampala riots, or if he was Andrew Kaira in 1987? Would he pose those questions? To me, just posing those questions is a small window through which we can look into General Sejusa's mind. Moreover, the same General Sejusa, we understand, is the one who commanded the arrest of the 3 Buganda ministers in 2009. He is alleged to have participated, or at least was knowledgeable in Kaira's murder, among many state terrorist activities committed by NRM. So, the equivocation displayed in the questions General Sejusa asked his audience is not only understandable, it is also explainable. One mystery in all this is hidden in the chairmanship of FAF by Omara Otuno, an Achori whose brother Olala Otuno has accused Museveni of committing a genocide in northern Uganda. What is going on here? There are too many contradictions to reconcile. General Sejusa has been called the butcher of the Acholi. A woman who shouted Sejusa down during the speech about the atrocities in northern Uganda was acknowledged by Sejusa himself as indeed shouting the truth. Sejusa's slogan at the FAF manifesto speech was that no elections can take place as long as Museveni is in power. But on the other hand, Olaro Otuno, president of UPC, holds the opposite view. His brother Omar Otuno is the chairman of FAF, who I believe holds the same view as Sejusa. There is more to explain than simply having a desire to defeat Museveni. So Sejusa's speech should have gone into the depths of this explanation, which is lacking. The other mystery is, where does Henry Gombia belong in all this? Kaira was killed in Gombia's home. Bwenje is convinced that Museveni was involved in Kaira's death. Sejusa now seems to agree with Bwenje. In fact, PAF manifesto lists Kaira, Andrew Rutakome Kaira, as one of the victims of NRM state terrorism. As Americans are fond of asking, under similar circumstances, what did Sejusa know and when did he know it? Reliable sources say that Sejusa, then Tinyefuza, knew about Kaira's death at about 6 a.m. local time, before the death was reported to the police at 7 a.m. This information is a matter of public record. The government of Uganda is yet to release the report to which Scotland Yard contributed a substantial part. In many respects, Sejusa's speech sounded incoherent to me. The absence of a theme seems to be the cause of incoherence, which in turn is the result of the absence of a philosophy to guide his utterance. An utterance is not the same as a speech. A speech, especially political speech, and you've listened to many, by Reagan, by Obama, by Bush, by Clinton, must have not only a purpose, but also a rational message communicated to the audience. For example, there is no convincing explanation in what Sejusa says why, if he knew all along the political situation under NRM was deteriorating, he nevertheless stayed and served the NRM regime for 27 years. Only after Sejusa began Okwejusa early this year did he then realize that Museveni had no staying power anymore. He suddenly woke up and made the decision to quit or abandon his friend Museveni when he needed him most. He left him stranded on a sinking ship. The Baganda have a proverb, Muno Mukavi, Ye Muno Dala. Sejusa's behavior could justifiably be called opportunistic. It verges on corruption, if in fact it actually is not corruption. The motive Sejusa has seems largely selfish. That is not a sufficient motivation for a liberation fighter like Nelson Mandela and others. That, however, is normal in politics and in a majority of human affairs. The burden is on Sejusa to prove otherwise. What Sejusa and many others in a similar position have to realize is that in a democracy, political behavior has to be governed and judged by morality and ethics. There can be no democracy without morality and ethics. That is why corruption is controlled. In this particular case, Sejusa's action is either driven by a rational philosophical premise, it is driven by morality and ethics as viewed by an outside observer like me, who is not part of the confidential circles of General David Sejusa. All the comparisons of GDPs Sejusa cites in his otherwise warm speech, punctuated by applauses, are meaningless. They do not explain why Uganda's income per capita is so low compared to say, Botswana, which has an income per capita of $13,000. Uganda's income per capita in 1966, 1 year before Botswana became independent, was far greater than that of Botswana. So what is going on? What explains the difference? General Sejusa's speech does not tell us. In his speech, Sejusa unfortunately seems to be trapped in the old ideological school headed by his friend Museveni. He, for example, talks about the need for the people to, quote, ideologically empower themselves. This means that, like Museveni, Sejusa thinks that an ideology has a positive role to play in rational politics. What people need to guide their political actions, in my opinion, is political philosophy, not ideology. There is no such thing as a good ideology compared to a bad ideology. A distinction Museveni loves to make very often without comprehending the subject actually he's talking about. I know many of my listeners will be shocked or surprised to hear what I am saying, but I mean it with all my heart. All ideologies are dogmatic and sterile. Ideologies cannot guide the politics rationally. Racism is an ideology. I do not know any rational person who can love racism as an ideology. So is sectarianism or tribalism. All ideologies are bad by their very nature. Even here in the United States, the Tea Party would rather repeal Obamacare or shut down the government rather than allow Obama to claim victory. Ideologies inevitably produce malicious politics, and this is a universal fact. This is the opposite of what Mandela would have thought and done under similar circumstances. Ideologies commit people to rigid doctrines, and as a result often blind them and commit them to irrational political behavior. Ideologies cannot be part of the democratization process in Uganda. This is true whether we are talking about the Soviet Union and the communism, which created the Gulag archipelago, where non-communists like Alexander Solzhenitsyn were severely punished for their beliefs. South Africa and apartheid, where declaring racial equality was a capital crime, and as a result, Mandela served 27 years in prison. Nazi Germany, where racial supremacy was supposed to be ordained by God. Or post-independency Africa, where one-party regimes were imposed as solutions to Africa's problems of development and democratization, but they achieved the opposite. One-party regimes were obviously incompatible with democracy because they denied people freedom and liberty, whether they were sanctioned by the saintly Julius Nyerere in Tanzania or the charismatic but dogmatic Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Ideology steered both Nyerere and Nkrumah off the course of rational political leadership and turned them into dictators. The rest is history. It's not for me to narrate. You can find it by yourselves. I'm responding to Sejusa's speech, urging us to commit ourselves to ideology as the empowering force. And I'm trying to say it is the opposite. Ideologies intoxicate their carriers, leading them into irrational political behavior. Museveni is a case in point. Museveni, in his simplistic, narrow-minded way, even thinks that some ideologies are good and others are bad. This is clear from sowing the mustard seed, where Museveni divides ideologies into two major types. Those of reactionaries, which he believes he does not agree with, and therefore they are bad, and those others of his choosing, which are good, such as those worshipped by Julius Kambarage Nyerere, Muammar Gaddafi, and Fidel Castro. Nyerere was a humanist, socialist. Gaddafi was a fanatic dictator who loved capitalist aggrandizement wrapped into a dubious socialism with no clear philosophical understanding. And Fidel Castro is a devout communist. Museveni wants to be all these three. Can he be? Or is he attempting to do the impossible? It clearly, Museveni is all three put together, and no wonder he cannot lead Uganda properly. In Uganda, we call Museveni's politics akatogo. For those who don't understand what akatogo means, it is a favorite dish loved by poor people especially because it is cheap to prepare but delicious. The recipe may, for example, include portions of meat, beans, bananas, and various types of vegetables, all cooked together in one dish. That is akatogo. And Museveni's politics definitely deserves to be called or described as akatogo. It clearly reflects Article 6 of NRM Constitution, which declares NRM as a multi-ideological political organization. Whatever that may mean, that's another ideological category. NRM is a political creature that will never exist in real life, except in imagination like a mermaid. I've come to the conclusion of my review of David Sejusa's speech and the manifesto, which was inaugurated on the same day of his speech. So, from the beginning, I made it clear that people will have to choose to decide for themselves after answering three questions. The three questions I posed at the beginning were whether General Sejusa is it the courage of a trained fearless soldier that brings him forward to fight this war? Or is it the ambition of a calculating politician whose options we are running out? Or is it the shrewdness of a seasoned spy that is preparing him in his political ventures? Hopefully I've said enough for you to answer those questions. But if you have not, I did not provide enough information for you to answer those, well, the conversation will continue some other time. This concludes my review of the FAF manifesto and the Sejusa's speech in London. But before I put my microphone down, I want to say a few words or to pass out a message about our fundraising. But before I do that, let me refer to a story told yesterday by Engineer Kagwa. The story was about liberation, and it was his mother who taught him what liberation is or should be, that people have to liberate themselves. Now, that lady's story is very touching. I felt that such a story from an old lady should be a story that should be broadcast on this radio, over the satellite, so that other ladies in the villages can hear that story, because there can be no better convincing voice on this issue than Engineer Kagwa's mother. And I'm sure there are many other mothers and grandmothers or even brothers who have similar stories, which could help us educate our people about what is going on and what liberation is all about. So, I want to put emphasis on Kagwa's mother's story, because to me it was very convincing that if such a story can be disseminated to the ordinary Ugandan on the radio, they would understand what we are trying to do. You know, there is no media freedom. I've gone through this. I've explained how repressive the regime in Uganda is. So there is no freedom. Nobody can publish the information we are free to publish here, to disseminate to the people. So, in conclusion, what I'm asking is everybody who is listening to go on FADU website. FADU is FADDU.org, and make a contribution so that the story like Engineer Kagwa's mother can be disseminated directly, even by the mother herself, to the people in Uganda as a process to strengthen the process of our liberation. Not only to strengthen, by the way, but also to speed up. Because once you speed up, then liberation comes faster. And it cannot come faster unless you are strong. And you cannot be strong unless you have the necessary resources to wage the war. And one of the resources we need is to purchase a satellite radio. So your contribution will be appreciated. And if you go to faduwebsite.org, make any contribution, be as generous as you can, be just do what is possible in your capacity to give, to donate. Thank you very much, and I think I'll stop here. Next time you will hear me, I'll be talking about democratization, not about FAF manifesto or seducer speech. Thank you very much.